The stock market has seen some pretty incredible gains over the past 18 months or so, and a lot of it has to do with the expansion and growth of artificial intelligence. And although we've seen so much growth already recently within the AI sector, the market size and revenues are actually expected to more than double by the year 2030. So for at least the next 6 years or so, the AI market should continue to keep a consistent compound annual growth rate. With that being said, right now is still one of the best times to be investing in AI companies, and these ETFs that we're talking about consist of some of the top players in the AI space, with the first one, which is SMH, one of my favorites, otherwise known as the VanEck Semiconductor ETF. And one of my favorite things about SMH is it has a fairly average expense ratio at 0.35%, but has outperformed really any other fund in the semiconductor sector that's not a leveraged ETF. It has a 1-year return of 78% and a current year-to-date return of 57%. And with this AI and semiconductor bull run that we've been in, its share price is right near the top of its 52-week range, with the current price of $265. And this is a very concentrated fund with only 26 holdings, with most of its weighting toward NVIDIA that currently makes up 25%. So needless to say, NVIDIA is one of the main driving factors of this fund's performance. But there is an ETF that's actually done better than SMH, and there is a reason behind it. It's USD, not to be confused with the US dollar, or the ProShares Ultra Semiconductor ETF. Now this one, in my opinion, probably shouldn't take up too much of your portfolio because it is a leveraged ETF, meaning its daily returns are 2 times the returns of the semiconductor sector. It's kind of like taking a sports car that's already super fast and adding some extensive modifications to make it even faster. So depending on market conditions and if you hold this ETF, your return could be extremely high or extremely low. For example, like I've been saying, this year has been incredible for the semiconductor sector, giving USD a year-to-date return of 189%, which is more than double the year-to-date return of SMH. But again, that is because it is a 2x leveraged fund, meaning you'll make double the returns when we're in a bull market, but that also means you'll have double the losses when the market takes a downturn, or even when the market is flat. Which is why I personally wouldn't put my entire net worth into this fund, because it's not unlikely to lose 40, 50, 60% with this ETF when the chip market goes through a losing period. Not to mention its fairly high expense ratio of 0.95%. But I also think this fund is a great tool to help maximize your returns if utilized correctly, so you really want to be extra careful with leveraged ETFs. Now moving on to a lot less risky of an ETF, we have SOXQ, which is the Invesco Semiconductor ETF. Now SOXQ is a fairly young ETF. It was first introduced back in 2021, so it only has a track record of about 3 years. But something that sets it apart from other ETFs is it has a fairly low expense ratio of 0.19%, which is of course going to save you a lot in fees, especially when holding for the long term. And the biggest difference between an ETF like SOXQ compared to SMH that we just looked at is that SOXQ actually tracks the Philadelphia Semiconductor Index and has NVIDIA weighted at 16.8% of its portfolio compared to SMH that has NVIDIA weighted at 25%. So they're very similar ETFs, but their portfolios are constructed in completely different ways since they track 2 different indexes. Now these last 2 are basically the same type of fund with just a couple differences, but they're both packed full of these AI-focused companies. It's both IYW and IXN. And the biggest difference between these 2 ETFs is that IYW holds and tracks large-cap technology companies only in the US, whereas IXN consists of tech companies that exist throughout the world. For example, you'll find companies like Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing and ASML in IXN's portfolio that you won't find in IYW. So even though both of these ETFs are extremely concentrated and focused on the tech sector, you can argue that IXN is slightly more diverse since it holds some of those global tech companies. Now both these ETFs have an expense ratio of 0.4%, but IYW is a slightly larger fund with about 19 billion in AUM, as opposed to about 5.2 billion in AUM for IXN. And although these ETFs are at or near their all-time highs, it could still be a good time to start dollar cost averaging into them for the long term, especially as AI and technology continue to dominate any other sector. So let me know what you think of each of these ETFs and whether or not you'd consider owning them in your own portfolio, and I'll see you next time.